Hitler, when he, conquered these countries, went right to the gold reserves.
Sure. On the same day, they would march straight into the central bank and confiscate the central bank gold. Czechoslovakia was quite clever because it sent most of its gold away before the Nazis got there. But then the Nazis had the Czech central bank send letters to the Fed and to the Bank of England saying the gold, sign over the gold from Czechoslovakia to Germany. And they did. So even stored elsewhere, the Nazis still got the gold. There were these farcical scenes. Poland in particular was one where the Polish gold was chased over the whole country with the Nazis right a day behind the Poles. And the Polish gold went to Romania. And then from Romania, it was shipped down to Turkey, to Istanbul. And then from there, it went to Beirut. And then from Beirut, it went to France. It stayed in France for a year or two. And then they realized it wasn't safe in France. And the French shipped it, without the Poles even knowing, to, of all places, Senegal. One of its, because the France didn't want to send its gold to America because it still owed American money in World War I, and it was scared America would take it. So they sent it to Senegal, and then it was shipped inland. They sent some to Mozambique, and then the British posted ships outside Mozambique to make sure that no gold left. And then they also sent some to Halifax. And so the Polish gold, somehow or other, it ended up in North America. That's the beauty of gold, and also its weakness is that whoever has the gold makes the rules. And I mean, that is kind of the case. And so that's why it's a great asset for central banks to hold, because, for example, America can annul your US dollars, or it can cancel its treasury bonds or whatever if it wants. But it can't do that to your gold. It's nobody else's liability. And that's why it's a great treasury. But it is also vulnerable, therefore, to people nicking it. Like if you get invaded and the invading forces come in and steal your gold, you're in trouble.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunk'd. I'm here with Dominic Frisby, and this is the next part of our series on his book, Daylight Robbery, which discusses the history of taxation. Today, we're going to talk about World War II, the US, Nazis, and the evolution of social democracies. Welcome back, Dominic.
Thank you very much, sir. And yes, the greater the war, the greater the tax burden. And so there was nothing quite like the Second World War. Greatest tax burden in history, and it gave ordinary Americans, it brought them into the ordinary Americans were paying income tax for the very first time as a result of the Second World War. Franklin D. Roosevelt, war costs money. And overall, in the US, taxes paid for, in World War I, taxes paid for about 20%. The US World War one war effort, and the rest was paid by debt and money printing. But ordinary Americans were still out of the tax bracket. Income only really affected the highest earners, but that all changed with the Revenue Act of 1942. And the number of Americans paying income tax rose from 13 to over 50 million. And 75% of working Americans found themselves paying income tax for the very first time, and they didn't mind. They thought they were doing their little bit. And Time magazine railed against it. It described income tax, this Revenue Act, as the biggest piece of machinery ever designed to separate dollars from citizens. It will demand and get more money from more people than at any time in the history of the Republic. And Time magazine was absolutely right. And there was this huge propaganda effort to get Americans. The tax was called the Victory Tax. And the Secretary of State commissioned Walt Disney to make a film starring Donald Duck proudly going and paying his income tax. Donald Duck, the typical American. And Irving Berlin was considered commissioned to write a song which Gene Autry sang called I Paid My Income Tax Today. And it had the lyric, 1,000 planes to bomb Berlin, they'll all be paid for. And I chipped in. Whatever the link between war and taxes. And in 1944, the top rate of income tax was 94%. That was the top bracket. Can you imagine that? And but over 90% of people thought the tax was fair, but not perhaps those that were actually paying it. And here's a good stat for you. America bought in World War II 13 million guns, 40 billion rounds of ammunition, 100,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, 10 battleships, 27 aircraft carriers, and 200 submarines. Enormous.
It's insane.
Financial burden.
It was 10 times the cost of World War I.
Is that right?
That is a quote from your book.
Oh.
I'll ask the author about it.
Yeah, well, it's amazing how much of this I've forgotten. It's been a really good exercise going back through it all. And 48% of the cost was covered in taxes this time. Remember, America made a fortune in the early part of the war selling essential products to both the British and the Germans. And no wonder you were so slow to get involved.
Capitalism.
Yeah, well, is that capitalism or is it crony capitalism? Anyway. And debt paid for the rest with a little bit of inflation thrown in. And it's said that America's involvement in World War II swung the war in favor of the Allies, and I think that's the generally accepted fact. In which case, income tax in America swung the war in favor of the Allies. But like all these things, what they call the ratchet effect. You have before the war begins, there's no tax. They introduce the tax in the war. Tax never goes back to where it was before the crisis started.
Mm-hmm.
That's World War II gave ordinary Americans income tax, and it's never gone away. So meanwhile, Germany, the Nazis came to power in, there's lots of arguments. It was all to do with Weimar reparations and so on. But the election voting data between 1930 and 1933 indicates that, with the world in the Great Depression and the previous administration pursuing a policy of austerity, we have to cut back our spending and so on. It's actually thought that Hitler won that election by promising to spend lots of money. This huge, and he actually inherited reasonably balanced books. And it's his predecessor, who was a chap called Brüning, at the last minute imposed some fiscal stimulus, and where he did, the Nazis actually lost seats, but it was too late by this point. And the Nazis immediately set off on this huge public works program, roads, to galvanize the economy, huge building. And even just by 1934, unemployment had come down, gone from 6 million to 2 million. And they were quick to take the credit. Roads, public buildings, stadiums, schools, hospitals, the rearmament thing, all saw huge public spending. And come 1938, Germany was at full employment. And there was actually a shortage of, coming to World War II, there was actually a shortage of supply of labor at this point, which the Nazis made good with slaves brought in from Poland especially, but also Jewish people. But the Slavs, I think something like 5 million Poles ended up as slaves, and 3 million of them died. And they were big believers in welfare as National Socialists. So there was we have the best welfare in the world, said Goebbels, and all sorts of unemployment benefits, disciplinary benefits, rent supplements, and all that were all ways by which the Nazis provided welfare to their own people, not to other people, of course. But even so, even with all of this, ordinary Germans paying taxes was not enough to pay for the war effort. And I love this story. Hitler himself was, of course, above paying taxes in 1934.
They always are.
The Munich tax office sent Hitler a letter demanding that he declare his income and pay his taxes. And Martin Bormann was managing all Hitler's money. Brilliant businessman. He made Mein Kampf set text in all schools, and so that accrued a lot of royalties for Hitler because every young German had to buy a copy of Mein Kampf. Hitler's image was on the stamps, and of course the post office then had to pay Hitler image rights, a bit like David Beckham or Beyonce or something like that. And but in any case, when the Munich tax office demanded to see that Hitler declare his income, there was it went quiet for a week, and then suddenly there was this announcement: all tax reports delivering substance for a tax obligation by the Führer are annulled from the start. The Führer is therefore tax exempt. Lucky Führer. Broadly speaking, come World War II, the taxes paid by ordinary Germans were sort of on the same level as taxes paid by ordinary Americans or ordinary Brits. And so the revenue was made up by taxing somebody else. And that, of course, was the Jewish people. And the persecution of the Jews began with taxation. It always does. A bit like we talked about the Jews in the persecution of the Jews in ancient Egypt, and that began with taxation, and so was it the case here. They worked to destroy Jews financially. Tax laws discriminated against them. Jews were required to register all of their property and assets. If it was discovered that they'd been hiding assets, they were sentenced to 10 years in jail and had all their wealth confiscated. And once their declarations were made, they had a 20% wealth tax imposed on them. They were, of course, a very wealthy socioeconomic group. The Nazis knew the Jews had money. Jews were also banned from working in certain sectors, civil service, the law, medicine. Jewish tax advisors had their licenses revoked, and Jewish actors were banned, and this went on and on. And entire hierarchies of bureaucrats were formed for the purposes of taxing Jews, and they found their bank accounts and anywhere there was wealth, and they just drained. And the Nazis made fortunes selling the possessions of Jews and, of course, confiscating their gold. And by the time they were put in concentration camps, even the Jews, they had dentists, like De Gooser, which is a smelting company, had a smelting office in Auschwitz. And Jews even had like the gold in their teeth.
Yeah, it was just unbelievable atrocities.
Yeah.
I remember one quote always stuck with me. It was a guy who his family had left when all this was starting to happen. A lot of the Jews were complacent, and his neighbor was Jewish, and basically he was Jewish, and this guy took his family and had children, saw the writing on the wall, and said, this is not good. I'm going to America. I'm leaving. And the neighbor was like, oh, it's bad, but it'll get better. It's not that bad, right? And like his decision to leave his family, and his neighbor had kids, family.
Yeah.
He basically said he landed in New York, and he said, that moment, that turning point when I just said, this is not going in the right direction, took his whole family and lineage, left to America, and said that was the difference between having a prosperous life, future generations, the difference between having your entire family basically burned in an oven in Auschwitz. So it was just I don't remember the exact quote, but it was just really a stark, decision point that he made. It was just wild.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very bold decision because the obvious thing to do is stay where you are and think it will get better.
Exactly.
It's a very bold decision to have made, but crikey, those who made it, I bet they're glad they did.
Yeah.
The Germans also did this thing where if they confiscated stuff off Jews, they gave them war bonds in exchange, but the war bonds would only be honoured if Germany won the war. So, and everywhere that Germany went, Western Europe, everywhere they conquered, they looted, they taxed, and then they did this thing where they would devalue the currency of the places that they conquered, and then so that German soldiers could acquire stuff on the cheap and then send it back home, and that they made a lot of money doing that, and they bankrupted local economies everywhere they went. And of course, not only was the property of those they conquered stolen, their labor was expropriated as well. And one of the things I like to think about is, we think of income tax as a money that you pay, but income tax actually predates income tax. It just didn't used to be paid in money. It used to be paid in labor. And, at one extreme, you have an anarchy where there's zero taxes, and I don't think a proper anarchy has ever really existed, probably never will exist. But at the other extreme, you have totalitarian society or a slave society, and the slave, as was the case with the Slavs and the Jews in World War II, they don't own their own property, and they no longer own their own body. And I think that's quite a profound thought. That is 100% taxation.
It reminds me of, with Rome and Napoleon, and you've got these societies that are conquering, and then eventually, when they run up against that, can't conquer anything else, and it starts to go the opposite direction. Everything sort of crumbles.
It does. And like Rome, that happened to Rome, but Rome kept itself going for another 300 years because it had mines. And so the money came from new mine supply. But then the mines depleted, and then the whole thing went tits up.
Fascinating stories about Hitler when he, conquered these countries, went right to the gold reserves.
Sure.
And just
on the same day, he would hear that the officers, they would march straight into the central bank and confiscate the central bank gold. And you had these farcical scenes like Austria and Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was quite clever because it sent most of its gold away before the Nazis got there.
Mhm.
But then the Nazis had the Czech central bank send letters to the Fed and to the Bank of England saying the gold, sign over the gold from Czechoslovakia to Germany. And they did. So even stored elsewhere, the Nazis
Yeah.
still got the gold. Of course, they stopped honoring this. They said they had to because otherwise, they were bankers and it was their obligation to, their integrity would not be valid if they didn't do it. Of course, there was a huge scandal. But there were these farcical scenes. Poland in particular was one
This is
where
my favorite.
the Polish gold was like chased over the whole country with the Nazis were right a day behind
Mhm.
the Poles. And the Polish gold, I think it went to Romania and across the border and then from Romania, it was shipped down to Turkey, to Istanbul. And then from there, it went to Beirut. And then from Beirut, it went to France. It stayed in France for a year or two. And then they realized it wasn't safe in France. And the French shipped it without the Poles even knowing to, of all places, Senegal. One of its, because the France didn't want to send its gold to America because it still owed American money from World War I, and it was scared America would take it. So they sent it to Senegal, and then it was shipped inland.
Oh.
They sent some to Mozambique, and then the British posted ships outside Mozambique to make sure that no gold left. And then they also sent some to Halifax. And so the Polish gold, somehow or other, it ended up in North America, but via all those countries, and farcical scenes as they tried to.
What was the one
escape it.
country where it was the one central banker and he had it was just one guy and he pretty much had all the country's wealth in gold. He was like on a train or something like that and pretending it was something else. Was that Poland?
Well, no, that would have been very hard to do because, these countries had, depending on which country, but between 50 and hundreds, sometimes hundreds of tons of gold in the case of France. And a ton of gold, if you visualize it, it'd be about the same size as if you can imagine a big beach ball.
Mhm.
That would be a ton of gold, a big beach ball like that. And so 50 of those, it's quite a few trucks.
Mhm.
And so I can't imagine one man doing that. There are so many examples of people running gold because when the Germans eventually took Hungary, they tried to ship the gold on trains. There were two different trains. There was one with the central bank gold, and then there was one with looted gold taken from Hungarian Jews.
Mhm.
And then that got intercepted by the Americans
Mhm.
In Austria. And then some of the gold made its way back to, like it was given to refugee charities.
Mhm.
This is the central bank gold eventually was returned because at this point Stalin had taken Hungary and he was demanding the central bank gold. But the gold stolen from Hungarian Jews and Hungarian citizens was never properly returned. And in fact, when American soldiers and British and allies, but it seems that the Americans were perhaps the worst, is, they would find bits of gold that was trying to escape Germany and get to wherever, with the Nazis, and they would find some of it. And, there was one guy who had a kilo bar on his desk as a paperweight, a kilo bar of gold, and loads of gold went missing. And there was this guy called Fisher who was put in front of this task force to find gold, and just loads of it just went missing. Some like Himmler's gold disappeared.
Imagine that.
And Fisher's thought that it was sent back to Germany, and
Yeah.
and American officers effectively had like beautiful Hungarian Jewish furniture shipped back to their houses. So it's it was a complete
Got reinvested
chaos
in the
in this
local
world.
economy. Went right into the local economy, buy some nice furniture.
So
You were talking
meanwhile-
about Norway. You didn't-
yeah, no. So there was a big fast to get the Norwegian gold, and they sent it north, almost to the Arctic, and eventually, with the Germans, like a day or two behind. Incredible stories of bravery, and eventually it was put on tiny fishing tugboats because they thought, that they wouldn't get bombed by the Luftwaffe. They just think it were local fishermen, and like 5 or 6 tugboats just brought the gold, and eventually they met an English warship, and it was taken over the
Oh, that's amazing.
over the Channel to Britain, over the North Sea to Britain. A guy called Magnus Hegland, I think his name was, but he was some kind of hero. They made a film about him.
Wow.
Great story.
Oh, interesting. What are your thoughts on the implications of gold being this physical bearer asset and the idea of in wars that that's the first thing that the army goes for?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what happens. And, that's the beauty of gold. And also its weakness is that whoever has the gold has the wealth. The gold is in the hands of the person that's got the gold.
Yeah.
and you can take the gold from me, and I can hope that you give it back. But if you don't give it back, there's not a lot I can do. You've got it now.
Mm-hmm.
And Bitcoin is the same. It's a bearer asset, whoever has it.
Uh-huh.
And gold is obviously the most fundamental natural wealth there is. And the saying is, whoever has the gold makes the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that is kind of the case. And so that's why it's a great asset for central banks to hold, because, for example, America can annul your US dollars, or it can cancel its treasury bonds or whatever if it wants, but it can't do that to your gold. It's nobody else's liability, and that's why it's a great treasury. But it is also vulnerable, therefore, to people nicking it. Like if you get invaded and the invading forces come in and steal your gold, you're in trouble. And so, this is an issue. I'd be interested to know what happened to Ukrainian gold after Russia invaded. That's a story I haven't heard. But I wonder if they have their gold elsewhere.
Yeah, they probably. I think the areas that Russia invaded, the separatist regions, all happen to be, prime farmland and coastland along the Baltic Sea. So I don't think they made it inland to probably where Kiev is probably where they have the gold. Or
yeah, but they would have, if Kiev was vulnerable. I mean, at one stage there were Russian forces close to Kiev, I think, and if the gold was in Kiev, they would have shipped it somewhere else. Anyway.
Yeah, you're probably right, for sure, for sure. I think.
I guess they haven't told anyone where they've shifted, which
smart.
kind of makes sense.
Yeah. I think, and a lot of Bitcoiners may feel this way, but I think that Bitcoin being this digital bearer asset provides a level of immunity that gold as a physical bearer asset doesn't have, right? I mean, with Bitcoin, you can have your wealth stored literally on chain with a private key, and whoever's invading doesn't even know who has access to that private key. You can have multi-sig private keys where 7 out of 11 officials you need 7 out of 11 to come together to unlock, that digital bearer asset. I just think there are some incentives against war that Bitcoin provides. There's not the same incentive structure where you can just target that central bank and go try to steal that physical gold if you conquer somebody. With Bitcoin, it's just it's much harder to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference between physical wealth and digital wealth.
Yeah.
And I agree that it makes a lot of sense for central banks to hold their wealth in Bitcoin, and it does make you that much more impervious to invasion as long as you get your security processes in place. The problem is, from a central bank point of view, is that Bitcoin is a relatively new asset.
Of course.
And they needed to be convinced that it is here to stay.
For sure.
Whereas gold, of course, it's been around since forever.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's more trusted. But even now, gold, in 2015, gold was only 10% of central bank holdings. It's gone up to 20% now. But I mean, at one point, gold was 80 to 90%. But let's talk about Britain in World War II, and a bit like American counterparts, income tax reached its highest level ever. In 1938, only 4 million out of 47 million were paying. By the end of the war, the number had tripled. And we had a higher rate of 97.5%. Our national debt tripled as well over the course of the war. And one of the big problems that we had is we borrowed the money domestically at first, but by the end of the war, we were borrowing the money mostly from the United States, and we borrowed it in US dollars. And the US dollar, of course, was a lot stronger than the pound after the war. The pound plummeted and was devalued after the war. But the value of our debts denominated in US dollars hurt us. And being English, we didn't renege on our debts. We paid them. What a mistake. And then, of course, there was the huge cost of rebuilding Britain after the war. We had something like 2 million homes were flattened during the Blitz. We had to rebuild all of those.
Mm-hmm.
America didn't suffer that. Germany obviously did. And, all through the war, there was this thing called the Lend-Lease Act. And so even after the war, America was still lending Britain astronomical sums of money. And the result of all of this is that we had to sell many of our capital assets down, particularly our capital assets in the US. It cost us our place in the global standing, World War II. It cost us our empire. A lot of the war we ended up paying through inflation as well. But this is what was so amazing about World War II from the British point of view, and it was different to every other war in history. Normally, when you won a war, you could pay for it with the plunder, the loot, the taxation of newly conquered territories. That was why war was such an effective business model for William the Conqueror, for the Romans, for Napoleon, whoever. World War II, we didn't get the spoils of victory. We didn't get to conquer and tax Germany. I mean, I'm sure there was some reparations. But so we paid the cost of the war. Britain paid the cost of the war, even though we won it. So taxes in 1947 were 3 times what they were at the beginning of the war. And we had been recently the world's wealthiest nation. We were still rationing food as late as 1954, 10 years after the war was over. We only settled our debts to Canada and the US in 2006. So it was successive generations were paying off the cost of that war. And Germany had its debt written off in 1953. We honored ours.
Japan as well.
Yeah. So, that's perhaps why we might have won the war, but Germany and Japan won peace.
I like that. Well, I think I've been thinking more about this, and there hasn't been a world war since, which is impressive, especially given the escalation of all of the money that governments have been able to amass and raise and contribute to the war machines all over the world and advancements in weapon technology. It just seems like it's much easier to finance, have massive wars. I mean, it's scary in a way, and part of the reason many of us have found our way to Bitcoin to put that power in check, of the government spending apparatus.
Absolutely.
Still very
The less you use fiat,
Yeah.
particularly as a savings vehicle, the less you support the system.
Yeah.
And you're right about there's not been a world war, but there have been lots of wars by proxy.
Mhm.
And
smaller
sometimes,
proxies.
obviously Vietnam and Korea and Iraq and Ukraine and Jordan, there's all these wars going on. And that the big beasts are getting
Of
involved
course.
on either side.
Oh, of course.
But
Of
there
course.
isn't, I mean, obviously, for Iraq, in a case of the Middle East, there are Kuwait, there are the spoil, there's all that oil. And so that's an important strategic
Mhm.
asset that you want to make sure you keep. And war is very lucrative. There's a lot of American men and women and families who've made a lot of money by supplying, from the military industrial complex, which is essentially rent seeking, by companies building weapons and selling them to the American army, and same with the British, but more so America, because your spending on your military industrial complex is so
Mhm.
big. But ultimately, it's the taxpayer that's paying. And I suppose you could say that the military industrial complex is propping up the US dollar, or it's a petrodollar, whatever. But it's not quite the same as, and people are on the other side of America will argue that America is a warmongerer, and it does get involved in a lot of external conflicts, even though it doesn't want to. But it's never been it's never been imperial in the way that it never conquered other nations and then looted and plundered them,
Mhm.
like whoever, Napoleon or someone,
Mhm.
or as the Germans attempted to do. So the
Yeah.
business model of war has changed
Mm.
in that respect.
Interesting. How much do you think the Treaty of Versailles and the failure of imposing all of that debt on the losing nation from World War I, many argue, was a big contributing factor, if not the main contributing factor, of Hitler coming to power after the hyperinflation of them trying to debase their money to pay back the victors of World War One, and kind of putting all that responsibility to pay for everything on the loser.
Well, it's generally accepted that that was one of the major causes, and really World War II was just the continuation of World War One. But World War One ended in 1918, and the Treaty of Versailles was largely. It was amazing. The amount of gold Germany had to pay back was more than the total amount of gold supply in the world at the time. So it was quite literally impossible. And Germany attempted to pay some of it back, and then it lost its pride as a result of all of that. And it was a nation in the 1920s that needed its pride restoring. And obviously we had Weimar inflation in 22, 23. But Hitler wasn't elected until 32. So it was quite a long time later. And as I say, there's an argument now that he just won that election because he was promising spending and his opponent was promising austerity.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't know, but
It's an interesting question because
for sure Hitler wouldn't have existed without World War One.
yeah, I think the German people just felt that national nationalistic rise of Hitler. They just felt like they had the boot on him. They
Yeah.
just were looking for, some
Well,
redemption.
he put Germany first, just like Trump is putting America first,
Yeah.
and that's why Trump is literally Hitler.
That's what they like to say.
So when World War II ended, the tax levels never went back to the levels they were before the crisis began. And this is always the way with taxes and crises.
Mhm.
Never go back to how they were. They came down a little bit, but they never went back to when they were. And now the government has got this new income. It's very reluctant to hand it back. And the act of paying income tax is normalized. And this is called the ratchet effect. And this ratchet effect enabled the social democracies that we live in today. And it's quite interesting. The countries that didn't get involved in the Second World War have much lower levels, especially of income tax, than those that did. It's not a hard and fast rule. It's a general rule. But for example, Chile didn't get involved in the Second World War. It has much lower levels of income tax than everywhere else. Ireland, Costa Rica, South Korea, Switzerland, they had much lower levels of involvement with the war, and so their government spending is much lower than places like France, Finland, Denmark, Belgium, Greece, which were all much more involved.
I want to prompt you on one thing real quick that we spoke about before, but we didn't talk about yet, because I thought it was really interesting because many people don't know this. The difference of the situation with Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill. You explained, I think Neville Chamberlain had all of his brothers die in World War I or something like along those lines.
Well, Neville Chamberlain is sort of looked back on as the great appeaser.
The great appeaser, yeah.
Whereas Churchill was the sort of hero who did the right thing. And, I talked about the cost of that war to Britain and the British. It was considerable, and we got nothing from it. And it's seen as a great source of national pride that we did this thing. But you could also argue it was a great source of stupidity. And once Hitler's attempt to take Britain, the Battle of Britain, had failed and we successfully fought them off, we could have maybe just stopped our involvement then. But we had to carry on. It was the right thing to do to stop Hitler and stop all the atrocities he was committing and so on and so forth. And so we did that. And the cost we paid, the price we paid was us. Britain's standing in the world. We could have taken another route. But Chamberlain, his attempts to appease Hitler is generally looked down on. But then when you understand, I think he had 4 or maybe 5 of his brothers were killed in World War I. So, he very much felt the pain of that war. You can see what would have guided him and what would have motivated him. And I think once you understand that, you perhaps treat him rather more charitably than you otherwise might.
Yeah, I found that very interesting.
I do.
We're taught here in the, Chamberlain, he's like the biggest failure ever, biggest appeaser. That's kind of the appearance. But
yeah, the French called him, instead of Chamberlain, they called him J'aime Berlin, which means I love Berlin.
Yeah, that's just a fascinating little tidbit of history there. And there's so much gray in life. There's people think everything's black and white, but there's so much gray. And the last thing I wanted to touch on in this chapter before we start talking more about the evolution of social democracy, which I found this is like one of my the most insidious taxes, and the name of it. As you debase the money, people basically graduate to higher tax brackets, even though they're essentially earning the same income. It's one of the most insidious forms of tax. It's very secret that nobody ever talks about. What's that called again? Fiscal drag. Fiscal drag. Fascinating.
So if you have, let's say you earn £100,000 or $100,000, and the tax rate is one rate for people who earn. They often set the tax rates. One rate for lower earners, one rate for middle earners, one rate for higher earners. And I think our threshold is £45,000 in the UK.
Insane.
Which is, once that was a lot of money, but now £45,000 is not a lot of money. And suddenly, once you earn more than £45,000, you're paying a 45% income tax rate. And so as you devalue the money, but you leave the thresholds the same, more and more people get dragged into higher tax brackets. And so the tax burden on the nation increases relative to what it produces.
We've got the same thing here.
It's a stealth. Yeah. It's a stealth form.
It's like a stealth tax.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's very like inflation. Yeah. And it also is part of the creeping surveillance state and violation of our freedoms is this laws written 50 years ago that like were made where when the money was, when your dollar could go a lot further, like $600 or $10,000 transaction over $10,000. That was like the cost of a house at the time. You know what I mean? Like an expensive house. And now it's like, you buy anything. It's like you're being reported on and collected and data farmed. Wild.
All enabled by fiat.
All enabled by fiat. All right, let's talk a little bit about the evolution of social democracies. My favorite quote: "The government that robs Peter to pay Paul can always depend on the support of Paul."
Absolutely right. And you talked about the other day, instead of taxation,
this is my
no taxation without representation.
no representation without taxation.
Absolutely right. I love it.
That's how it should be.
Yeah.
And you gotta put something in before you can start calling the shots.
It's great.
Got to have some skin in the game.
So I should write that down actually and write an article about it because it's a very good point. So these new tax rates remain, and in the post-war area, the governments have got all these obligations to help the wounded, to rebuild the country, and all of that. And so it exploits the new tax structures that are in place to do that. And but as a result of all of this, you saw the nature of government change. And so once upon a time, government would have been responsible for the army, the police, the infrastructure. And so now suddenly the government's getting involved in education, in welfare, in healthcare, which are all functions that had previously been the responsibility of churches. And you can just see the huge changes in government spending. If you think in Australia, for example, in 1870, for example, in the UK, taxes were about 9% GDP. And even 1913, just before World War II, they were still only at about 12 or 13%. Now they're 40%. In 10 years ago, they were 50%. And in the States, in 1913 in the States, taxes were about 7.5% of GDP. And this is excluding inflation. By 22, they were like at 43%. So government grew. But it's interesting that government is, as a percentage of what it spends, it's spending less on roads, on infrastructure, on the military. Even in America, you wouldn't think it, but they are. But they're spending more on stupid things, welfare, healthcare. America spends more per capita, even though you don't get free healthcare, it still spends more per capita on healthcare. And as you're discovering with all the stuff that's happening with Elon Musk and Doge, a lot of your tax money is just going on these stupid, corrupt frivolities instead of basic stuff like roads and the army and the police.
Yeah, I know you hit the nail on the head, which, you talk about this where taxes have gone from not being local anymore to being like federal, which reduces like any level of accountability. We have no accountability, like from USAID to the Pentagon, failing every single audit. I mean, like, where is all this money going? $10,000 trash cans, supposedly. It's insane. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah, one of the beauties of local taxes is people tend to be happier to pay them because they can see the effects of their taxation more immediately. So, if you're taxed and it goes to pay for a new town hall or something, you can see what your tax was used for. But actually, and once upon a time, I think local taxes in the States, let me just find it, but in the UK, local taxes were about a third of total revenue at the turn of the 20th century. Now it's 3%. It's gone from 33 to 3%. And in the States, something like 40% of US taxes were collected at the local level on the eve of World War I, even as late as the Great Depression, 40, 50%. And now it's less than 10%. Taxes are levied locally. And part of this is governments will collect taxes where they're easier to collect, and deducting at source makes them easy to collect. It's hard to do that locally. When if it's taxes by remote central authority, it's harder to resist. Whereas taxes locally, you tend to pay them after you've earned the money, and so people are more reluctant. There's more scope for non-compliance, basically. And of course, Margaret Thatcher's attempt to raise local taxes backfired and ended her career. And one of the big new taxes that's come along, remote taxes that's come along, is of course VAT. And I think that started in France. Well, let's talk about deducting at source, because this is the powerful thing. So that began in the US, the Current Tax Payment Act of 1943. In the UK, we had PAYE. And it meant that not only were taxes deducted at source, previously taxes were deducted like twice a year. Now they could be deducted as they were earned. And so the money more quickly made its way to the government. And the goose became less aware that it was being plucked. And all the tax authorities admit that, it's just a more effective way of collecting the money. And so now it's everywhere in the world. In the developed world, taxes are deducted at source. And that's one of the reasons why taxation tends to be higher in the developed world. And of course, with everything being digital now, it gets even easier. And income taxes, you tell the company they have to collect the income taxes for you. And if they don't do it, the company gets into big doo-doo. We also got the evolution of VAT and sales taxes. And in the 60s, it was just France. VAT is a French invention, like all the things that are wrong in the world. Metric and VAT, that's what France has given us. Terrible place. And today, 166 countries around the world have VAT. You don't, but you have sales taxes, which is very similar. And so there's a great quote from Adam Smith: "There is no art which one government sooner learns from another than the art of draining money from the pockets of the people." And so they copy each other, and VAT rates around the world are between 15 and 25% generally, and it's a sales tax. Now, some say VAT is fair because everyone pays the same amount. Others say it's unfair because it's easier for the rich person to pay than it is the poor person. So, two different arguments. But anyway, wherever you sit in the argument, it doesn't change it, because it's not going anywhere, because it's easy to collect. And so governments will keep it. And this is also why developed nations are better at collecting taxes than developing nations, because of the fact that their financial technology is basically advanced. And so governments in developed world countries tend to control a much higher proportion of the economy than they do in developing nations. If you were to compare, like France, central government spending is almost 50% of national output. In Nigeria, it's 6%.
Wow. And
so collection improves as countries develop. And we talked about the way that spending has changed. It's no longer on defense and military. It's on welfare and stupid things with AID. USAID. Now,
and also, you said this that taxes now are not just running the government; it's wealth redistribution, anti-capitalism, all this stuff with USAID.
It's become a tool of ideology.
Yeah, and my favorite is they're finally getting rid of it, but institutionalized racism, DEI.
Well, there you go, and this growth in government that we've seen since World War II, it's as I say, you're at the beginning of this new golden age in the States, but you're seeing it in Western Europe. It carries on, and it's a few percent every year. You don't notice it year in, year out, but it's incremental. But if you take a step back over a 100-year period or a 50-year period and look at where we were and where we are, you're like, how was that allowed to happen? And you don't nip these things in the bud; they carry on. Now, you've got a Florida businessman who I like, Dallas Hostetler, and he felt that it wasn't clear how much the average person is paying in tax. So he came up with this idea of Tax Freedom Day, which is the day of the year when the debt of the citizen to the government is paid and your money is suddenly yours to keep. And he calculated US Tax Freedom Day. He even trademarked it, and he's given it away now. And, it's a slightly imprecise calculation, but by comparing the tax freedom days of countries around the world, you can see just how much the burden of government is in those countries. And in the US, Tax Freedom Day comes late April, early May, something like that. We have to wait till June in Britain, and in France and Belgium. I told you they were backward. It's not till the final week of July that their debt to the state is complete. And in Tax Freedom Day, it's a Florida businessman came up with this, but the doesn't include inflation, debasement of currency. It's just But you just think at the turn of the 20th century, Tax Freedom Day came in mid-January.
Yeah. I mean, if you live in France or Belgium, I mean, you're basically worse off than a serf was.
Well, in a funny kind of way, we all have much higher standards of living because of technological improvements, and technology is liberating. We can fly anywhere in the world. We can talk to anyone anywhere in the world, yada, yada. But the medieval serf had to give half his working week to his lord in exchange for the lord's protection and the right to work his land. In the 21st century, the dynamic is the same. Between 40 and 60% of the ordinary citizen's labour is taken by the state in exchange for the protection of the state and the right to exist. Of course, conditions today are considerably better. We have more freedom of expression. We have more movement, technology. Benefits far exceed their medieval equivalents. But in terms of time taken, it's exactly the same.
And we'll end it there.